I'm going to be talking about Thomas Nagel. If you're not familiar with him, he was born in 1937. He's an American philosopher, best known for his clear, accessible writing on consciousness, ethics, and the meaning of life. After studying at Cornell, Oxford, and Harvard, he taught for decades at Princeton and then at New York University, where he became university professor of philosophy and law. He was actually born in Yugoslavia, but he's an American philosopher, all right? And he's known, one of his most famous essays is called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" So he's really interested in this question of consciousness. And in this essay, "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" he argues that subjective experience cannot be fully captured by objective science. To influential books on morality, political philosophy, and everyday philosophical questions, such as what does it all mean? He also came out with a book called Mind and Cosmos in 2012. Is that what he said? Anyway, but he's gotten a little bit sideways with some people because of his take on physicalism. He basically just doesn't think that a purely physicalistic approach provides a solid foundation for understanding the universe. Basically, that mind can't be produced or can't be reduced to the simple chemical functions of the brain. So let's see now. Now, I pulled out a little part of what he wrote early in the book because it's when it comes to philosophy, it's not about whose team are you on, or who's the big guy you're pulling for, or something's true because Socrates said it, or whatever. And in the case of Thomas Nagel, you may be saying, well, why should we listen to him? Well, I'll let him speak for himself. And what he says is, what I say will reflect my own view. This is Thomas Nagel speaking. My own view of these problems, and will not necessarily represent what most philosophers think. There probably isn't anything that most philosophers think about these questions anyway. Philosophers disagree, and there are more than two sides to every philosophical question. My personal opinion is that most of these problems have not been solved, and that perhaps some of them never will be. But the object here is not to give answers, not even answers that I myself may think are right, but to introduce you to problems in a very preliminary way so that we can worry about them, so that you can worry about them yourself. So that's just a little bit of background on Nagel. And so here's a few lines of intro for my script, and then I'll get off my script here in just a minute. Have you ever wondered about the nature of reality or questioned the certainty of your own experiences? How can you be sure that the world around you is real and not just a construct of your mind? These are the kinds of questions that philosophers have pondered for centuries. Whether it's considering the nature of reality, life after death, or other mysteries, what does it all mean will challenge your everyday assumptions. Nagel's ideas can sharpen your critical thinking, broaden your philosophical perspective, and provide a richer appreciation of life. So, talk about chapter 1. Well, it's actually, chapter 1 is called The Introduction. And so he says, philosophy starts from ordinary questions. How do we know anything? Do we have free will? And what makes life meaningful? Nagel's goal is not to give a full history of philosophy. In fact, he doesn't really go into history at all. I don't think he even mentions a philosopher in the entire book. He sort of indirectly mentions Dostoevsky because he has the quote about if God doesn't exist, then all things are permissible. But so he's not interested in teaching you, Aristotle and Socrates and who came first and what their school of thought. He's just going straight to the questions because he's thinking his mode of thinking is these questions are at the heart of what all these people have been looking at for all these centuries anyway. So we'll just bring our perspective to it. All right. So he stresses that philosophy often begins in puzzlement and can make familiar things look strange. So just by taking a more granular view at things, it does sometimes take you to some surprising places. But I think I mentioned assumptions here in that opening page, and that's really, as I've been reading and rereading the book, I think that's uh, a big key to this is uh, really examining our assumptions. And so much of life doesn't make sense that we just sort of paper over it with assumptions. But what he does is pokes holes in those and shows where the logic doesn't follow. The book is aimed at non-specialists and avoids technical jargon. He throws out a few terms, and we'll look at terms like solipsism and determinism, but he doesn't get into deep, complicated uh, terms and such. He encourages readers to suspend assumptions, as I was saying about suspending your assumptions, and test their own beliefs, not just learn what some famous philosophers said. So what I'll do is I'll show bullet points, which are also on your sheets, and I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as I can. We're here until
2:30 is usually when these meetings end.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll just try to keep it moving along because I want to try to cover as much as I can. So on this slide, I've just pulled a quote from the book. Philosophy is different from science and from mathematics. Unlike science, it doesn't rely on experiments or observation, but only on thought. And unlike mathematics, it has no formal methods of proof. It is done just by asking questions, arguing, trying out ideas, and thinking of possible arguments against them, and wondering how our concepts really work. Let me just see if I want to say anything more about his opening line there. And also, Steve posted on your meetup a link so you can get the whole book. If you don't have that, if you have a device with you, I encourage you just open the book up because we'll be reading directly from it. Okay. All right, we'll just move on to chapter 2. So, how do we know anything? So, epistemology is the area of philosophy that deals with how we know things. Um, and if even the question might not make sense at first to someone who hasn't really delved into philosophy. How do I know something? Well, I just know it. I just see it. There it is, and I know it. But how do you know it, right? And so he's introducing the idea of skepticism. And there is a possibility that we could be radically mistaken about the external world. How can you prove that you're not in a dream right now? Right? I could tap on this, okay, but wow, this is just a really solid dream. This is a very highly realistic dream. Anything I point to is just more evidence of what's coming in through my perception. You can't get outside your own head. And I will mention another philosopher, Kant, as well as Hume, talked about how we can't, well, Kant specifically was the one that said we can't know a thing in itself. We can only know our perceptions of that thing. So he asked what justifies our belief in a world beyond our minds, given that we all directly have, all that we have are our experiences. And solipsism, as I mentioned before, solipsism is the extreme view that one's own mind is the only thing that exists. And it's kind of funny because he talks in the book about solipsism, and he says, well, if I were a solipsist, why would I write a book? Because, to be read by imaginary people. Okay, but he leaves the problem open, but suggests that skeptical possibilities are hard to live by and may reveal limits of what certainty can mean. So ultimately, it is just kind of an assumption, something we kind of have to live with. But he raises some interesting questions about it. So let's read another excerpt from the second chapter. If you try to argue that there must be an external physical world because you wouldn't see buildings, people, or stars unless there were things out there that reflected or shed light into your eyes and caused your visual experiences, the reply is obvious. How do you know that? It's just another claim about the external world and your relation to it, and it has to be based on the evidence of your senses. But you can rely on that specific evidence about how visual experiences are caused only if you can already rely, in general, on the contents of your mind to tell you about the external world. And that is exactly what has been called into question. If you try to prove the reliability of your impressions by appealing to your impressions, then you're arguing in a circle. The Bible is true. Why? Well, it says it's true. Moving on to other minds. Okay, so let's just say you guys are real. I'll grant you that. You're real. This is reality. Okay. But how do I know you're not all robots? You could be. It's not illogically a foregone conclusion. The only thing that you can directly experience is your own thoughts, and then other minds are inferred by their behavior. In other words, I'm going to assume that you also, like me, have a mind because I observe you and I watch your behavior and we interact together. That at least gives me some evidence. Nagel notes that the evidence for other minds is indirect. You see bodies, behavior, language, but not inner experiences. Now he talks about inner experiences like, for instance, the taste of chocolate ice cream, right? So you and your friend go to the ice cream shop and you get a chocolate ice cream cone and your friend gets a vanilla ice cream cone. And you both enjoy your ice cream. But how do you know that when he's tasting vanilla, what he's actually experiencing is the exact same thing you're experiencing when you're tasting chocolate? Well, you can taste his and then you know the difference. But again, that brings you back to your experiences. You can't directly experience his direct experiences. It's possible that he's having a completely different experience. So he brings up solipsism again as the idea that perhaps only your mind exists and that others are like complex robots. The egocentric predicament is what I was referring to earlier. We're stuck in our own heads. We can't get outside of our own minds to observe things directly. It highlights that we never step outside our own point of view to compare appearance with reality itself. And finally, he suggests that while belief in other minds is natural and practically unavoidable, giving a fully satisfying proof is difficult. So again, it's one of these things that we're going to just take it for granted, but just know that it's not grounded philosophically. Now, here's a quote from this chapter. To take a simple example, how do you know when you and a friend are eating chocolate ice cream, whether it tastes the same to him as it tastes to you? You can try a taste of his ice cream, but if it tastes the same as yours, that only means it tastes the same to you. You haven't experienced the way it tasted to him. Next is the mind-body problem. Nagel asks how conscious experience, the what it's like to be you, relates to the physical brain. So physicalism is the view that mental states are nothing over and above brain states, potentially explainable in scientific terms. And this is where Nagel says he rejects that view. He says it's not adequate to ground it philosophically. That's his view.
Yeah, well.
And then and we're going to have a ton of time for Q&A. So
Yeah.
Dualism, the view that the mind and body are fundamentally different kinds of things, raising puzzles about how they interact, right? You got a mind, you got a body, but can your mind?
Machine.
Yes, right. The ghost in the machine, right. He highlights the tension between the subjective character of experience and the objective third-person world of science. He does not claim a final solution, but shows why reducing mind entirely to brain feels unsatisfying. And a quote from this chapter is, but there is also a philosophical question about the relation between mind and brain, and it is this: is your mind something different from your brain, though connected to it, or is it your brain? Are your thoughts, feelings, perceptions, sensations, and wishes things that happen in addition to all the physical processes in your brain, or are they themselves some of those physical processes? Have a seat anywhere. Okay, we're going to come back over all this. I know you guys probably are having lots of questions, and we're going to go back. We can go back through the slides. You've got your handouts, but we'll just keep soldiering through here. So that's the mind-body problem. Okay, so here's a quote from that. Okay, then the meaning of words. All right, so I got to be totally honest. This one, I read it, and I've reread it, and I've listened to it on audio, and I just don't get it. He's basically saying, I even called a friend of mine who is a philosophy professor. His name is Gilbert. He's a neighbor of mine. He teaches at Kennesaw State. And we talked about it for about 15 or 20 minutes. And the only phrase that came out of that conversation that he seemed to think I was at least heading in the right direction is what makes, to say what does a word mean, that's trivial. You just look it up in the dictionary. But what makes the word mean that thing? That's the question, right? So I feel like we just are, as humans, we are just instinctive meaning makers. So I'm not sure where the problem here is, because if you're using a word, if we have an object and we agree that that object has a certain word, and then this is, language is part of our culture. It just seems pretty straightforward to me. So we can dig a little bit deeper, but here's what he says. He says the chapter asks how words and sentences come to have meaning at all. Nagel considers how sounds or marks on a page can represent things, thoughts, or states of affairs in the world. Like if you draw an O, that's either a zero or the letter O, right? At least if you're an English speaker. But if you just scribble like our friend on our of course, the meaning of that was pretty clear. But anyway, let's see. He connects language to rules, shared practices, and the intentions of speakers and listeners. There's a distinction between the physical shape of a word and its meaning or sense. So basically, the puzzle is how purely physical events, ink marks, air vibration. So he's talking about speaking, he's talking about writing. I suppose this would apply to this physical computer where I've put these words on it. It's all this physical stuff, and yet it's conveying concepts which are non-physical. So let's see what else he has to say about the meaning of words. The mystery of meaning is that it doesn't seem to be located anywhere, not in the word, not in the mind, not in a separate concept or idea hovering between the word, the mind, and the things we are talking about. And yet we use language all the time, and it enables us to think complicated thoughts which span great reaches of time and space. And the problem I have with this quote is where he says, not in the word, not in the mind. But that's exactly what it is, I would think. If I say horse, I'm picturing in my mind a horse. And anyone else that understands English is picturing the same thing. So I'm just
coming from Wittgenstein.
there. And my friend Gilbert brought up Wittgenstein, which I'm not as familiar with. If someone knows more about Wittgenstein, I'll hand you the mic. But let's see. We'll just move on from that. Oh, he did say, that's a continuation. Okay. Yeah, he's saying you can talk about how many people in Okinawa are over 5 feet tall or whether there is life in other galaxies, and the little noises you make will be sentences which are true or false in virtue of complicated facts about faraway things that you will probably never encounter directly. So again, this chapter has just left me a little bit puzzled myself. So anyway, we'll just keep moving. Free will. My friend Andy and I have talked about free will a time or two. Andy's also in my Spark group. Thank you for coming, Andy. Oh, so free will and determinism. Nagel frames the free will problem as a clash between our sense of choosing and the idea that every event has a cause. And again, it goes back to food examples about, I think he talks about ice cream again, actually. When you made that, he talks about chocolate cake and a peach. So you're in line at the cafeteria and you're like, should I get the peach? Should I get the chocolate cake? You go with the chocolate cake. You regret it later. And you say to yourself, I should have had the peach, right? I could have done otherwise, right? But if the laws of the universe govern human beings just like they govern planets, then there was something that happened right before you made that choice that made that choice inevitable. And there was something that happened before that that made that inevitable, all the way back to the Big Bang. That's what determinism is saying. If everything is governed by the laws of nature and prior conditions, then every action is fixed in advance. This seems to threaten moral responsibility. If you could not have done otherwise, can you be blamed or praised? And so there he talks about punishing someone for doing something bad would be, similar to punishing the dog for peeing on the rug. The dog hasn't made a morally bad choice, but you just don't want any more pee on your rug. So you take care of the dog. So in other words, even if we all embraced determinism, we probably still would have prisons because we just want to take the people who have already demonstrated that they can't be trusted. We just want to take them out of polite society. This seems to threaten moral responsibility. So compatibilist views try to reconcile free will with determinism by focusing on acting according to one's own reasons and desires. Again, he leaves the issue unresolved because it is an unresolved issue. There's no definitive yes or no. But although this is one of the most strongly, even in our own philosophy group, this is one of the intuitions that is most strongly fought back against. Like, of course I have free will. It's so obvious. I feel free. And I was actually talking to Nikolai on the drive over here, and I just have to look at it. I think of like Stephen Hawking when he talks about model-based reality, right? So like a man's walking in an airplane. He's leaving his seat to go to the bathroom, right? So he's walking. So that's what, 3 miles an hour. Is he going 3 miles an hour? Well, in one sense, he is. But he's also on a jet plane. So he's going 500 miles an hour. Okay, but wait a minute. The jet plane is going around the Earth, and the Earth is rotating. So these are all correct answers depending on how you're looking at it. So I think if you're looking at reality from purely the view of the physicist, then there's no escaping determinism. But if you're looking at reality as a human being, there's no escaping free will. So that's how I make it compatible in my own mind. Determinism. The idea is not that we can know all the laws of the universe and use them to predict what will happen. Yeah, sometimes people get confused with determinism and predestination. It's not like somebody decided here's the plan and controlled every atom going forward. It's just that, one billiard ball hits the next billiard ball. First of all, we can't know all the complex circumstances that affect the human choice. Secondly, even when we do learn something about the circumstances and try to make a prediction, that is itself a change in the circumstances, which may change the predicted result. But predictability isn't the point. The hypothesis is that there are laws of nature, like those that govern the movement of the planets, which govern everything that happens in the world, and that in accordance with those laws, The circumstances before an action determine that it will happen and rule out any other possibility. Now, he doesn't take a strong position. Like when you read Stephen Hawking, he'll describe himself as a hard determinist. Nagel doesn't actually come down with a strong view on that either. He says, again, it's an open question. Next, morality, right and wrong. This chapter asks what makes actions morally right or wrong. This was one of the better chapters because it's just peeling back the layers. Well, I did this because it was the right thing to do. Well, why do you do the right thing? Well, because it makes me feel good. And you just go on and on and on. Nagel contrasts relativist views, right and wrong depend on culture or preference, with objective moral theories. And I think he does. It's a little bit hard to read. He lays out a pretty good case for relativism. He introduces a utilitarian style thinking, focus on consequences and overall good, versus duty-based views. Some actions are just wrong, regardless of outcome. Nagel also considers the idea that morality requires seeing ourselves as just one person among many, not the center of the universe. That's a little bit like Kant with not that every person is a means in himself, not a means to an end. He doesn't actually mention it, but just thought that was interesting. He emphasizes that ethical reflection can, of course, change how we live. So just wrestling with these issues of morality can just enrich our lives. Okay, for example, some people believe that even if you can get away with awful crimes on this earth, such as acts forbidden by God, He will punish you after death. So even when it seems to be in your interest to do such a thing, it really isn't. If there is no God to back up moral requirements with the threat of punishment and the promise of reward, morality is an illusion, according to some people. And this is that Dostoevsky quote I was mentioning: if God does not exist, everything is permitted. We'll go back to this chapter I'd like to spend more time on, but let's keep going. Justice. Now he's talked about the individual and he's talked about other minds. Now he's talking about society in general and how society should be organized in the most fair way possible. The one thing he does take a stand on is the idea that to completely eliminate all inequalities, we would need to have a command economy. And he's not in favor of that. He's still in favor of a competitive free market economy. But he does talk about societal inequalities. He asks which inequalities are unfair and which might be acceptable or even necessary. Why would you think an inequality would be necessary? Because he said that even if we were achieved an ideal situation of equality of opportunity, we're still never going to get equality of outcome just because people have different skills and levels and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of inequality that is just necessarily acceptable just because we're human beings. Not everyone can act like Meryl Streep or paint like Picasso. The chapter explores the ideas about equal treatment, merit, need, and how institutions can be evaluated morally. He distinguishes between personal charity and structural justice. When he's talking about structural justice, he's mostly talking about redistributive taxation to make it fairer. Let's see. He suggests that thinking about justice requires stepping back from our own position and imagining a more impartial standpoint. So let's see a quote from this chapter. I myself think that inequalities resulting from either of these causes. So what you say, either of these causes, what do you mean? So he talks about first, there's inequalities caused by racial and sexual discrimination, okay, things like that. And then there are other inequalities caused by just where a person finds himself in the socioeconomic, ladder by no fault of his own, right? It seems unfair. And that is clearly unjust when a socioeconomic system results in some people living under significant material and social disadvantages through no fault of their own, if this can be prevented through redistributive taxation and social welfare programs. But you have to consider both what causes of inequality you find unfair and what remedies you find legitimate. Oh, God. All right. The fun topic. Death. Nagel asks whether death is bad for the person who dies, and if so, how, given that they no longer experience things. And he lays out one theory that's like it's an evil in the sense that there were things that you could have gone on to experience. He discusses the idea that death deprives us of goods we would otherwise have had. And in that sense, death is a bad thing. But then again, if we're not there to know that we've been deprived, what's the trouble? Now, this asymmetry puzzle, I think, is interesting. When he talks about the asymmetry puzzle, there's a Mark Twain quote. I can't quote it exactly, but he said, I was dead for thousands of years before I was born, or I didn't exist for thousands of years before I was born. And that didn't trouble me in the least. So he's talking about his own, looking forward to his own death. He's looking back, right? I didn't exist before I was here. Why would I care about not existing after I've been? But it is a puzzle. We do not usually worry about the infinite time before we were born, yet we fear the time after we die. Well, and again, I think that's a little wobbly too, because, obviously we didn't worry about the infinite time before we were born because we weren't there to worry about it. He raises questions about whether fearing death is rational or an expression of our attachment to life. And he shows how thinking clearly about death can reshape how we value time, experiences, and priorities now. Okay, we all accept the fact that there was a time before we were born when we didn't yet exist. So why should we be so disturbed at the prospect of non-existence after death? But somehow it doesn't feel the same. The prospect of non-existence is frightening, at least to many people, in a way that past non-existence cannot be. That's the asymmetry. All right, we're already there. Making good time. Number 10, meaning of life. Really liked this chapter. If we have time, I want to spend more time talking about this.
Sure.
So let's just run through it. The final chapter asks whether life has any overarching purpose. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Or whether meaning is something we construct. Nagel introduces the idea of the absurd, the clash between our search for significance and the fact that the universe is indifferent. I guess that would be another reference to he's using absurd as in a technical, philosophical way. He suggests that stepping back and seeing ourselves from an objective standpoint can make our lives look trivial, but that we still care deeply from the inside. Rather than despair, he proposes a kind of ironic acceptance, acknowledging the absurd without letting it paralyze us, which is exactly the guy rolling the hill, the guy that rolls the myth of Sisyphus. Yes. So you know it's absurd, but you just keep rolling the hill, rolling the rock up the hill anyway. Meaning may not. Yeah, Sisyphus is happy, right? Meaning may not come from a cosmic purpose, but from particular activities, relationships, and projects we find worthwhile. Yeah, I didn't disagree with anything you said in this chapter. The idea seems to be that we are struggling to achieve our goals and make something of our lives. So he's talking about, trying to find meaning. But this makes sense only if those achievements will be permanent, but they won't be. Even if you produce a great work of literature, which continues to be read for thousands of years from now, eventually the solar system will cool, and all trace of your efforts will vanish.